Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to have you on ConLaw. It's going to be a fun semester. I start off the semester with the easy part. My very first day teaching years ago was my birthday, and I brought in cookies as a way to celebrate. And every semester since I've done the same, so you all get cookies to start with. In fact, one semester, I actually forgot to bring in cookies, and someone had watched the video from last year, like, where are our cookies? So I brought in the second week of class. I have Costco cookies, they're very good. I have more to distribute beyond the cookies. I also have these. They're pocket constitutions. You're required to bring one to every class. Bring it to class every single week. Got it? Okay. I also have these. They're temp cards. What is that? So I can learn your names fairly quickly. I want you to write your names on these in a fairly large font like this. I have markers too. So you take these out, fold them up, and write them really big. If there's a nickname you like, I don't care. Write whatever you want. I'll call you whatever on here. No, it's true. I don't care what I call you. It makes no difference. As well, I have the seating chart. So I'm going to pass this bag around. Start it over here. Take a marker. Take a name card. And take a constitution. Okay? All right. I think that covers everything. As far as giving stuff out. The second thing to discuss is the clicker. I sent you all instructions of how to sign up. It's very straightforward. You download the app. It's called li-lvi. And the way it works is I'm going to start class every day by opening up the attendance. Okay? When you log into your app, you should see an option for signing in for attendance. Several of you have already done so. If you can't figure it out now, don't worry about it. Ask me after class. No one will be marked absent today. I'll figure it out. But for class on Tuesday, you should all have this straightened out. Okay? In fact, 30 of you already signed in. Very good. Okay. That's all I'm going to do in terms of procedural stuff today. Today will be a fairly unique class. In every other class this semester, I'm going to ask a lot of questions. In fact, I do very little lecturing. Today is the exception. Today I will lecture straight for the next hour and 55 minutes. Hold all questions till the end. The reason why I'm doing this is I want to walk you through the entire Constitution, the entire Articles of Confederation, and the entire Declaration of Independence in a very short time. It's ambitious, but I do it every semester. This will give you the entire document. It's a damn shame that most law students graduate without reading these documents in their entirety. They're not very long. So you will have it. You will have read every single provision of the Constitution. Understand? So follow along. It's recorded. You can watch it later for questions, but follow along. All right. So our discussion today begins with the Declaration of Independence. Now, I assume that none of you have ever taken a class in American history. I assume that you know nothing about American government. I make that assumption precisely because many of you haven't. Everything you'll need to learn about American history, you'll learn in this class. So don't think for a second that any of you are at a disadvantage because you haven't studied this stuff in college. I promise you, you are not. You might think you are, but you really aren't. So our story begins on the holiday you know about fireworks and hot dogs and barbecues. But the holiday represents much more. The Declaration of Independence wasn't merely a document to express why the American colonists were unhappy with the British. It was a legal document. The same way that you all prepare memos in legal writing. Right? You have your issues, you have your rules, your analysis and conclusion. The Declaration operates in a very similar function. Right? What's the issue? You're not treating us fairly. What's the rules? The law of nature and nature's God. Right? What's your analysis? Because the king is not respecting these natural rights, he has violated his duty as a monarch. And the conclusion? Independence. This was drafted by Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and others. Most of the framers were attorneys, and they operated as lawyers. So I want to walk you through this line by line, and I'm going to focus on the parts that are highlighted, which give you a little bit of insights. The very first line in Congress, the unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States, the entire idea of saying the United States of America was a novel concept. Today we say the United States of America is a country, right? But back then, it wasn't a singular body. These were 13 separate states. Indeed, they were previously colonies. By merely calling themselves the United States, they were making a legal representation of what this body actually was. Now, the first two paragraphs, almost everyone's probably heard before. No one's read the rest of it, but I want to go through the first two paragraphs slowly. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds, this is what was going on. They were breaking apart the legal connection with Great Britain, which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. Now, you all know in your legal writing class, what's your rule? Cite a statute, right? Cite a case, cite a precedent, cite common law. What is the law the Declaration is appealing to? There's no statute about Declaration. There's no Supreme Court case. Supreme Court didn't exist yet. They are appealing to a higher power. We can argue for months about what that is. But Jefferson described as the laws of nature and of nature's God. And that law entitles them a decent respect to the opinions of mankind. And they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. This wasn't a mere political statement. This was a legal statement. Now here comes the part we all read, right? There's a lot more to it. Everyone knows this part. We hold these truths to be self-evident. What does it mean to be self-evident, right? Remember torts, res ipsa loquitur, right? It's so obvious. There's no debate. It's right there in your face. And what's that truth? That all men are created equal. Of course, the contradiction is slavery, right? But by stating it, they made a principle that eventually you have to live up to. Which is an important point. Stating it means you have to actually do something about it. And they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. What is an inalienable right? It means you can't give it away. It also means it can't be taken from you. It is inherent in your body. And what are these inalienable rights? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? These are the basic things which people are born with, which cannot be taken away. Now, the next part people never actually read. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Think about that for a second. Why do we have government? Have you ever asked yourself that, right? Why do we have a government? Why do we have a Congress? Why do we have a president? At least for Jefferson and the signatories, it's to protect these natural rights. It's not for giving this benefit and that benefit. It's to protect these rights in the first instance. And the reason why these governments have power, and not just any power, just powers, powers that are warranted, is because of the consent of the governed. That is, the people agreed to have this government in place to protect their natural rights, and with that, give the government power to take action, right? Government doesn't have action by virtue of its existence. It is action by virtue of the consent of the government. The governed. And here comes the rule, right? Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, and King George, as we'll demonstrate, became destructive of those ends, It is the right of the people to alter or abolish that form of government and create a new one, a new government, right, to affect their safety and happiness. What's going on here? Jefferson's saying, because the king is not protecting our natural rights, we have the right, the duty, and the obligation to create a new government that will. Now, Jefferson's perhaps a radical, but not that radical. He says, prudence indeed will dictate that you shouldn't change governments for light and transient causes. In other words, you don't have a revolution because they pass a bill you don't like, right? There's got to be a really big deal, a long train of abuse, absolute despotism. When you have such a case, it is the right of the people, not just their right, their duty, their obligation, to throw off such a government and create a new one. Now, I want you to keep in mind, right, we're used to criticizing the government all the time, Twitter or whatever, right? We say the worst things you think of. Back then, criticizing the king was an act of treason. It was an act of treason for which you could have been executed. So all the people signing this document and calling the king a despot, they were signing their death warrants, right? If the Americans lost the revolution, there's no guarantee they prevail. If they lost revolution, they would have all been executed as traitors. Okay? Calling the king absolute tyranny, no good. Now, it's not enough for Jefferson to just say, hey, king, you're a tyrant. He actually made the case. This is why legal right professors insist on the analysis. Why is the king a tyrant, right? Why is this the case? Jefferson lists a number of grievances, right? Objections to the king's rule. And I'm going to go through these a little bit quickly, but I want to focus on a few. Because many of these grievances gave rise to provisions in our Constitution. A lot of the things the king did that the colonists didn't like were subsequently reversed by our Bill of Rights. So the king refused to assent to laws. The very first freedom, which you never think about, is the right to govern yourself. The right to make your own laws. The king didn't let the colonists make their own laws because he and Parliament were in charge of representation. The king forbid the governors to pass laws and suspended all other laws that were in effect. The people lacked representation. He called legislative bodies in distant places over in England where the American people could not act them. He has dissolved representative houses. He has caused others to be elected. The first several grievances were all about the right to govern yourself. One of the themes we'll talk about in this class is who gets to govern which branch, the executive, the legislative, or the courts. Keep this one in mind. He has prevented the population, prevented people from going to the new colonies. Number 7, right? Number 8, he has obstructed justice. He's refused to establish courts. In the English system, judges were dependent on the king for their salary. That is, if a judge issued an unpopular ruling, you're fired. That is no means to have an independent judiciary. That's why our courts, judges, have life tenure. He's erected offices and sent swarms to harass our people. What does this mean? Taxes. The king would send inspectors to people's homes and businesses without any particular warrant to take their stuff and impose taxes. He has kept standing armies among us. Today we think of the military as a fixed institution, but back then you only needed an army in times of war. And in times of peace, you dissolve the army. Okay? Our favorite, the Third Amendment, right? For quartering a large body of troops among us. People have to keep British soldiers in their homes. For cutting off trade, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us of the right of trial by jury, right? For abolishing a free system of English laws and altering the forms of government. This is the grievance that goes on and on and on. Okay? Let's see where else. Okay, let's go on. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. What does that mean? We've asked the king gently, delicately, please fix this problem. But our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. My favorite lines. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. If you actually write that in my teacher evaluation, I'll understand why. But that's my favorite lines in the entire document. There it is. This next paragraph is actually fascinating. At this point, they weren't Americans, they were Brits. And they were appealing to their fellow British citizens. Look, our brethren, our brothers, right? We appeal to you. We are your brothers, we are your friends. Give us these rights. But even if you're friends in peace, in times of war, you're enemies. We often think of the Civil War, brother against brother, right? North and South. The Revolutionary War was no different. Americans were Brits, right? They were British people. They were sovereigns of the king, subject to the king. And they were now going up in arms against their brothers. Now comes the big conclusion, right? We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, right? Not United Colonies, United States. They were no longer colonies. Appealing to the supreme judge of the world, who is that? I'll let you think for yourself. For the rectitude of our intentions due in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Look at that for a second. That these colonies are now states. In a single sentence, they transitioned from a colony to a state. That's powerful. You guys want to take a class in legal writing, do this, right? It doesn't take a lot to get there. And that now they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. And that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, because it may not work out, right, completely dissolved. Again, this was an act of absolute treason. But this wasn't merely a declaration of independence. This also established the first form of American government. What can these free and independent states do? What all states do. Commence war, conclude peace, make alliances with foreign nations, establish commerce, that is business relations with other countries, and do all the other acts and things which independent states may have right to. Now, it's often said the Articles of Confederation were the first government, the first governing document of our new republic. Not so. It's only a couple sentences there, but they declared what sorts of things can be done by this new government. At the very end, Jefferson's basically saying, like, yeah, we're probably going to be killed over this, but it's worth the fight. Jefferson was actually a coward. He actually was in he was governor of Virginia during the war, and when the British were invading, he basically fled and he got out of town. So he was never actually in the front line himself, but many of these people indeed were. And it says, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. In other words, we're probably going to get killed over this, but we're going to go for it. And then there are 56 signatures in the Declaration. You can scroll through these names. The most famous one, which everyone knows of, is John Hancock. He put his name big. I have a picture of it here. He put his, where is it? Yeah, it's faded, but this is a huge one right there. It's much bigger than everyone else. And he put his signature right there, saying, for the world, I agree with this declaration. There was no guarantee this was going to work, right? I want you to keep that in your mind. There was no guarantee this would work. By all accounts, this could have backfired in an awful way. They will be executed. But after a bloody war that lasted several years, and with the assistance of the French didn't really care about us, but they hated the British, so it made for a useful diversion. So the French were allied with the Brits, and independence was won. One note, though. So I'm assuming many of you have heard of the show Hamilton, a Broadway show. So incentive. I am a season ticket holder. I have tickets. The highest score in the midterm gets a ticket. Whoa. The A+ paper in the midterm gets a ticket. That show will teach you more about the revolution than probably I will in an hour. So go watch it. It's much more effective anyway. But, so incentive. All right. But winning the war, what was that line that Washington, winning is tough, governing is harder. I think there's a line that Washington said to Hamilton in the show. The first form of government was one that you probably had never heard of before this. So if you have, I'm proud of you. The Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. The Articles of Confederation was signed in 1781. Our Constitution was not drafted until 1787. And it was not ratified until 1789. Write those dates down, please, right? Don't get these wrong. Declaration in 1776. The Articles of Confederation, 1781. Constitution drafted, 1787. Constitution ratified, 1789. Bill of Rights ratified, 1791. Do not mistake those dates, my friends. So there was almost a decade before our Constitution came into effect. Right? So until 1787, our republic was governed by this document. This document known as the Articles of Confederation. Okay? Okay? And the Articles of Confederation were drafted during a very tumultuous time. They were drafted during the middle of a war. And as you can imagine, they weren't focusing too much on the specific forms of government because they were trying to win the war. In hindsight, we know that the Articles didn't quite work out. There were a lot of problems with them, which I'll discuss. But at the time, no one knew that because time hadn't happened yet, right? We always look at 2020 hindsight. So what I want to do in walking through the Articles is flag the stuff that didn't work out well. Why? Because the stuff that didn't work out well in the Articles formed the basis for many of the provisions in our Constitution. That is, you can't understand our Constitution unless you understand the failures of this document, the Articles of Confederation. Understand? Okay, very good. So this one is a much clearer copy. So he says in big letters, to all to whom, right? What the hell does that mean, right? The Articles of Confederation was basically a greeting to the world, saying, hey, here we are. We just won independence from the Brits. We're a new country. Be our friends, right? To all to whom these presents shall come, we, the undersigned delegates of the states, affix to our names and greeting. Hi, right? Articles of Confederation. Now, whenever people hear the word Confederation, they go, oh, the South, right? The Confederacy. But the phrase Confederacy doesn't have to be in the South. It refers to a league or a group of states, right? Articles just means a legal document. So this was their legal document for this Confederation of States. It's also called a perpetual union, right? What's that word perpetual mean? Forever. They were really hoping that this document would last forever. It didn't. Barely made it 5 or 6 years. Note, our Constitution does not have a similar provision. A question of whether a state can secede, can the union be dissolved? Article 7. And it lists the various states that were part of it. And it says, at the very beginning, what's the style, right? What's the name of this confederacy? The United States of America, here we are, right? But it wasn't a single republic. These are states separate, but united as a whole under the Articles. The purpose of this document is to create an umbrella under which these various states would have authority. Okay? Now go to section 2. Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States. Now I'm going to ask a question, you don't have to answer it, but you probably never thought of it before. Where does government get its powers from? Now Jefferson says it comes from the consent of the governed. True enough, right? No objection there. But where do the states get their power from? This is an important concept. Before 1776, all the power of the government resided in who? The king, right? The king had all the power, all the sovereignty. What happened after independence was declared and war was won? That sovereignty, that power, went to who? States. Each of the 13 colonies became 13 states, and they stepped into the shoes of the king, perhaps the crown, you would say. Right? That is, the states absorbed the power that the king did. Right? They had the sovereignty, freedom, independence, power, jurisdiction, and right. What did the Articles do? By the Articles, the states expressly delegated that authority to the United States. Right? Understand that point. It's an important point. Before independence of powers with the king, after independence of powers with the states. But by signing this Articles of Confederation, the states expressly delegated some of their authority to the national government, to do national stuff. Right? But the key word here is expressly. Only those powers expressly given away are now in the United States of America. Everyone understand that point? The same exact analysis would apply with our Constitution. By ratifying the Constitution, the states gave up some of their power, right? Because a power given to the federal government means the states lack the same power. If the states give Congress the power to declare war, that means the states can't declare war. If the states give Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce, that means the state can't regulate interstate commerce, right? It's one or the other. As states surrender their power, the federal government gets bigger. This was a fairly modest delegation, though. Right? Why? It's described in Section 3 as a firm league. If you guys didn't get it yet, don't worry, we can get it after class. Oh yeah, give it that way. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's described as a firm league of friendship. Imagine that, a firm league of friendship. These are just pals, right, meeting around. That language is very deliberate. And what did this firm league of friendship do? Establish common defense, military. Secure liberties. Provide for their mutual and general welfare. And defend themselves against all force. Okay? Now, how better to secure and perpetuate this friendship? You have to have some unity. So this provision begins the tap dance around slavery. They don't use the word slaves. They allude to it. For example, free inhabitants. Okay, that's saying not slaves. And these free inhabitants receive the privileges and immunities of, again, free citizens in the several states. What does that mean? A privilege and immunity is a right. You'll see this phrase over and over again. If a person lives in New York and he travels to New Jersey can't treat him differently. They can't deprive him of the rights they give their own people, right? This was trying to create a national economy where people could travel with free ingress and regress. It means exiting and entering to enjoy the privileges of trade and commerce, okay? But we see another reference to slavery. Removal of property, slaves. And if a person shall flee from justice, it's required for one state to surrender them. So even in the 1780s, they were aware of this issue, and they tried to work around it. Okay? Full faith and credit given to each state. What does that mean? If you have a contract in New York, a judge in Pennsylvania must honor that contract and enforce it. We have that to this day. In our Constitution, we have a full faith and credit clause we'll learn about. Okay? Now, how is our government structured, right? We have Congress with two houses. You have a House of Representatives, you have a Senate, right? The Articles government had only a single house. It was unicameral. And each state had one vote. Big state, small state, didn't matter. Every state had one vote. So you had little Rhode Island, bitty bitty Rhode Island, right? And you had like humongous Virginia, which had 20 times the population. They were equally represented. And the states had the power to recall their delegates. So if a person in Congress voted the wrong way, the state can bring him back home. This is effectively like an ambassadorship, right? Think of the United Nations or some other body. Every state sends a single member, they have a vote, and that person votes the wrong way, their country hauls them back in. That's how the Articles of Government was envisioned, like a national body that you would send to a foreign country. Okay? Each state shall have one vote. One of the few limitations, though, of the Articles of Government is that individual states would have limited power over foreign affairs. For example, states should not send ambassadors. States should not receive ambassadors. States should not make treaties and alliances. Right? States should not give titles of nobility. States should not even enter into treaties with each other. As designed, it was the federal government that would have power over international affairs. It didn't actually work this way, because every state started negotiating their own international trade treaties. This didn't work very well at all. Okay? Vessels of war should not be kept up in time of peace. All right? No state shall engage in war without the consent of the United States unless invaded. Again, they're trying to say, war, national matters, give this to the central government. No. One thing which law students always chuckle at is an obsession with pirates. The framers were very, very concerned with piracy. Now you think of all your Captain Jack, right, Johnny Depp. These were very bad people. They basically would raid the harbors, go rob a town, light it on fire. There wasn't all the people that was wisecracking with pirates, right? This is a really big deal. So one of the few exceptions of keeping a navy was to basically take care of states that are infested by pirates. Infested, right? It's a word used for cockroaches. Okay. All charges of war shall be decided by Congress assembled. Now, the single biggest weakness of the Articles of Government, the single biggest weakness, was taxes. Congress lacked the power to tax people in the states. All they could do was submit what's called a requisition. A requisition is like a request. They could say, hey, Virginia, you want to give us some money? Virginia actually paid their bills. Other states didn't. And this created a lot of animosity because some of the wealthier, more prosperous states were paying their requisitions. And a lot of the other states weren't. And the government went broke very quickly. One of the most tragic parts of Washington's battle against the Brits is he had no money. Right? He didn't have money for supplies, for food, for munitions. Right? He was broke. And they made do with very little. So one of the greatest weaknesses of the Articles was their inability, their absolute inability to actually fund the government. Okay? This is one of my favorite ones. A letter of marque and reprisal. This is basically a license to become a pirate. What this means is the government says, we're going to let you take a private ship and go invade a foreign place and take stuff. And you get to keep whatever you want. It's basically a license to be a pirate. One of my students a couple years ago got me a letter of marque and reprisal. It's hanging on my wall. It's very cool. It has my name in it. It looks very cool. It was very well. Someone paid attention in class. I liked it. Again, the Articles of Confederation had limited federal courts, but only for piracy matters. There was no system of unified federal courts. In fact, the only reference to some sort of court is boundary disputes which were resolved in Congress. So again, no national judiciary under the Articles of Confederation. Okay. Okay. This provision is actually going to be very similar to the Constitution. What are some of the powers for the central government? Setting weights and measures. You may think, what the heck is the big deal, right? You ever think about what a pound is? What an ounce is? What a gram is? Who gets to decide that? Unless you have a unified system of measurement, you can't measure the weight of money. Gold, right? Coins. So setting a national standard for coins and money and alloy was really significant. One of the powers of Congress was to manage affairs with the Indians, right? They did not want the states doing that. States did it anyway. If you notice, almost all the things in here they were quickly ignored, right? They didn't actually follow this document at all. The central government would establish post offices, right, to create a national system of transporting information. That was the only way of sharing information across seas. Okay? Now, this will be a question if you're ever in jeopardy. Who was the first president of the United States of America? The answer is not George Washington. What'd you say? How do you know that? Very good. John Hanson. He was the first person elected as the president, office of the president, under the Articles of Government. Now, the reason why no one's ever heard of this guy is he didn't do anything. I can't figure out anything he ever actually did. Maybe it's a new point, I don't know. But this was a very ineffective position. It didn't really do anything, so we don't really consider it having much significance. Okay. What else? Okay. So another deficiency of the Articles was that it took a lot of votes to get anything done. There were 13 colonies. It took basically 9 votes to do anything. Not 7, a majority, but 9, a supermajority. Getting 9 of the states to agree on anything was virtually impossible, because you had the northern interest, which mostly about trade, the southern interest involved in agriculture, slavery. There were very different sectional differences in the United States that made it difficult to get 9 votes to do anything. Okay. Any Canadians in the room? We should have 1 or 2. Canada was given a free pass, so if they wanted to enter the United States, they were allowed to. They didn't take us up on it. They're lost. The U.S. government would take on all debts that were assumed before the Revolution. Yeah. So every state shall abide by the determinations of the Congress assembled. In other words, states were required to follow Congress's judgments. They didn't. They ignored it. Again, they do this thing. The union should be perpetual. Okay? And any change must be unanimous. Right? Again, if any changes be made to this union, all 13 states had to agree. As you read in your reading, that didn't happen. That did not happen. At least not right away. And then this last part saying, well, we hope this thing works, right? We appeal to the great governor of the world to ratify these Articles of Confederation, perpetual union, and we ratify and confirm these articles. Okay. Again, perpetual, right? They were really like hoping this thing would work out. In the year of our Lord, 778. Again, it was drafted in 78, was not ratified until Maryland came along in 1781. So I've sketched this document for you, right on schedule, an hour, usually takes an hour to do the declaration of the articles. The big problems here, Congress couldn't tax. Small states and big states had the same representation. And there was no way to make the states actually follow the rules. This was a very weak union. And it soon became clear that something had to be done. So, in 1787, a convention was formed. And the original purpose of the convention was to propose amendments to the Articles, to make changes to it. That's not what happened. Again, under the Article, you needed unanimous consent to make any changes. The convention was set for Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 with the express purpose of making amendments to that document. Amendments to the document. As the meeting was convening, members from Virginia and other states said, wait a minute, we need to start from scratch, right? This is not working for us. We're not going to be able to fix this. We have to scrap it. So in many respects, the actual act of the Constitution was unconstitutional. Why? The Constitution said we will ratify this document when 3/4 of the states go along. 3/4, 75%. The Article said, no, 100%, 100%. So the very act of ratifying the Constitution ignored all that garbage about perpetual union, right? The document wasn't even 5 or 6 years old. And they said, we're going to start from scratch. And this is the document, which I'm sure you've all seen. It sits under glass at the National Archives of Washington, D.C. If you ever go there, it's actually quite faded. This is a very contrasty photo, but you can barely even read it. The ink has been so faded over the last 200 and some odd years. But the Constitution was drafted in about 3 months over the summer of 1787, from about May till August of 1787. Can you imagine undertaking such a project in 3 months, right? How long does it take you to write a memo that's like a couple pages long? 3 months to write an entire government. And there were dozens of people working on this around the clock. and they operated in secrecy. Everyone knew this was going on. It was actually held at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and they had shutters in the windows. And there was a strict bar on reporting it. In fact, James Madison, who took very detailed notes about his interactions at the convention, insisted that they not be published until after he died. Right? They did not want these proceedings to be public. Why? Not everyone wanted a new constitution. A lot of people were happy with the old system. And they were afraid that by leaking information, opponents would get wind of it and find a way to kill it. Right? There was no guarantee this government would even work. So the Constitution was the product of dozens of people working over the course of the summer and coming to a compromise that not everyone agreed to. And this document will be submitted to the states for ratification. Again, there was no guarantee they could even draft this document, and even if they were able to draft it and agree to it, there's no guarantee states would ratify it. And not all the states even participated. Some states just boycotted the convention because they didn't agree that it was legitimate. So in the next hour, which is all I have, I'm going to walk you through the 7 articles of the Constitution, followed by the Bill of Rights. Now, people often think the Bill of Rights and the Constitution are the same thing. They're not. The Constitution was ratified in 1789 without any amendments. There was a strong understanding that amendments would be added, but they're not guaranteed. So when you think of the structural Constitution, when I say structural, I mean the one in 1789, the first half of the semester will be entirely on the Constitution of 1789, the structural components. Only in the second half of the semester do we go on to the Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment, what are called the rights provisions. I think that breakdown makes no sense, but that's often how it's described. Okay. Let's begin. Very famous thing which you've already all heard. We the people. Of course, the irony is not everyone was represented. Slaves, women, Indians, the like. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, that is, we're not quite there yet, getting better, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. In other words, we hope our kids can benefit from this, no guarantee. Right? The last government lasted 5 years. Let's hope this one lasts a little bit longer. Indeed it would. Our Constitution is the longest serving document in the world. No other government's had a single Constitution for this long, anywhere. To ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Okay. Now, I read the preamble. Probably will never read it again. Courts don't look at it. It doesn't have any legal relevance for the courts, but you're still allowed to read it and understand the background of the Constitution. Okay. The 7 articles of our Constitution are structured in a very logical way. Okay? You're going to need to memorize this. Okay? Article 1 of the Constitution concerns Congress, the House and the Senate. Right? Article 1 is Congress. Article 2 is the executive, the presidency. Article 3 is courts. You need to know that very clearly. Article 1 is Congress, Article 2 is presidency, Article 3 is the courts. 4 through 7 are different, we'll get there. But you need to know the 3 branches of government, there are 3, are laid out in sequence in the very beginning. Okay? So Article 1, Section 1 begins, the legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House. That's it right there, right? In a single sentence, our Constitution created the basis of our representative republic, Congress. And what powers does Congress have? Legislative powers. What is a legislative power? We'll discuss that, but it's not everything. And what type of legislative powers are given? Only those herein granted. That is, only those powers granted in this document. The Texas legislature, right, has what's called a police power. They have the same powers that New York had in 1776, right? States have a very broad power to do basically whatever they want, subject to certain limits. Congress doesn't. they have what are called enumerated powers. They only have the powers given to them, granted to them by this document, right? If Congress is not given a power by this Constitution, they can't do it. So a classic example is family law, domestic law, right? If you want to get married, if you want to get divorced, want to issue custody, you go to a state court, right? You don't go to a federal court. Federal law just has nothing to do with marriage. They just don't do much about it. We'll do a case which reflects that later this semester. Okay? So Congress only has those powers here and granted, an important point. If it's not granted to Congress, Congress can't do it. Article 1, Section 2. Okay? What is this House going to be like? It will compose of members chosen every 2 years. Qualifications, you have to be 25 and 7 years a citizen. So if any of you celebrate your 25th birthday, it's a constitutional birthday. You can now run for Congress. Mazel tov. You're not eligible, right? I only have one left. 35 will hit a couple of years, but can't be president quite yet. God save the Queen if I'm president. Right away, the Constitution tries to remedy one of the big problems: taxes. Direct taxes can now be apportioned not only on the states, but on the people. Now, this is not an income tax. We know we have an income tax, right? If you work before, the little thing on your paycheck, they take up a stab for income tax. This is not an income tax. This is what's called a direct tax. What's a direct tax? It's a tax assigned based on the number of people in the state, right? Basically, everyone in the state will pay the same rate for taxes. It's not based on how much income you're earning. Now, as it turns out, Congress never really enacted many direct taxes. We just don't have them. They could have, but they never did. But this gave rise to one of the first major debates in our Constitution, and one that implicates slavery directly, which is the 3/5 clause. Now, most people have heard of it. No one actually knows what it means, right? Now, let me blow your minds for a minute. There were two issues, right? Representation and taxation. Two separate issues. The bigger a state's population is, the more representatives it had in Congress, and the more taxes it would pay, right? So the northern states didn't want the southern states to include their slaves in the population. Why? It would have given the southern states more representation. If the southern states had more representation, they would have more votes in the Electoral College, and it would make it impossible to eradicate slavery down the road. The northern states actually wanted slaves to count as 0/5, 0% of a person. The thinking was, look, these slaves aren't going to be paying taxes anyway. Why should they count for representation? Perversely, it was the southern states that were trying to maintain their authority that wanted to count the slaves for representation. Now, slaves couldn't vote, right? They couldn't vote, but they would count. So the compromise that struck was this. Northern wanted 0, Southern wanted 100%. They settled on 60%, somewhere in the middle. By doing that, it gave the South a big electoral boost. It's no surprise that almost all of the first presidents were Southerners, most of them Virginians, except for John Adams, right? Because why? Southern states had a boost in the Electoral College because of the slave population, which continues to grow, right? But had the Southerners prevailed, they would have had a bigger share in the Electoral College. And the fugitive slave trade probably would have never been repealed. So this provision is not well understood. People think it's actually the opposite. It's degrading, but in the opposite manner, because it was actually used to maintain the Southern supremacy in Congress and the Electoral College. Okay? Next paragraph. Every state has at least one representative. It's based on population. So this cures the Articles. Big states like Virginia might have 20 representatives, and poor little Rhode Island has only one representative. They have at least one. Okay? But here lies the Great Compromise, which you read about. What was the Great Compromise? Having two houses. The House of Representatives is determined based on population. The Senate is fixed. Every state has 2 senators, right? So Virginia has 2, and Rhode Island. I keep picking Rhode Island. It's a really small state. You can drive in 15 minutes, basically. Rhode Island had only 2 senators. Now today, people are very angry at this, right? Why should Wyoming have the same representation as California, which has like 100 times as many people? That was the great compromise reached 200 years ago. Okay? The other key point is senators were not elected directly. Initially, the legislature chose the senators. This was an attribute of what we would call today federalism. Federalism, right? That the state legislatures pick who goes to Washington. That was eradicated by amendment 100 years later. Okay? Again, to be a senator, you have to be 30 and 9 years a citizen. If you turn 30 soon, you are now eligible to be a senator. Happy birthday. Okay? And we have this person as vice president. The vice president is a very curious position. He has no real power, so he doesn't really do anything. Right? John Nance Garner, Texan, said he's not worth a bucket of spit. He was right. One of the few things the VP can do is cast a vote in the event of a tie. That if the Senate splits 50-50, for example, the VP breaks a tie. That's about it. Doesn't have much other responsibility, except if the president dies, he elevates up. Okay? One thing we'll get to this semester, the Senate tries all impeachments. Now, people don't understand the impeachment process. It's 2 steps, right? First, the House votes on articles of impeachment. That is, we want to remove the official for this reason. That takes a majority vote. Then the Senate holds a trial, an actual trial, where every senator is a finder of fact. You need 2/3 of the Senate to convict and remove a position. And if the president is the person being impeached, the Chief Justice presides at the hearing. Okay, we'll do impeachment later this semester. Okay, so now Article 1, Section 4 concerns timing of elections, not very important for us. Section 5 also timing of elections. Can you impeach members of Congress? The general answer is no. What we can definitely do is expel them. So each House can vote by 2/3 vote to kick out a member of Congress. Okay. This one we'll come back to later. Each House can control the other House in an important way. They can't adjourn without the other's permission, right? So if the Senate wants to go on Christmas break and the House says, no, I don't want you to go to Christmas break, the House can actually keep the Senate in Washington, which is an important tool for collaboration, although it doesn't have much effect. Okay? This one's important as well. The salary for senators and representatives is paid not by the states, but by the central government, the U.S. Treasury. This is what's called the speech or debate clause, which basically says a person can't be arrested for something they say in Congress. You can't punish someone for expressing their mind as a representative. Keep in mind, this was ratified before the First Amendment. We didn't have free speech yet, but members of Congress got this privilege. Okay. Okay. All right. Article 1, Section 7. This is how Congress goes about taxing people, right? Taxes must originate in the House of Representatives, the House closest to the people. Okay. How does a bill become a law? I hope everyone's seen the Schoolhouse Rocks video. If you haven't, Google it after class. 2 steps. It has to pass the House, pass the Senate, and present to the President. This is what's called bicameralism and presentment. Remember this. Bicameralism and presentment. Bi, to, cam, House, right? Bicameralism, presentment, passes both houses, presents to the President for his signature. If he signs it, it's law. If not, it's what's called a veto, goes back to Congress. Congress can override the President's veto with a vote of 2/3. That is, if 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate agree, the President's veto is overridden, and the bill becomes a law. Okay. The next part of the Constitution is one we'll probably spend half of the semester on, and I want you to flag in your notes. It's Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8. This provision lists all of the enumerated powers of Congress. Okay? So in other words, if on the exam I ask you, where does Congress get the power to do something? With maybe 2 exceptions, the answer is Article 1, Section 8. You have to pick the right clause, right? There are a lot of clauses there. But this is where almost everything Congress can do comes from. A couple exceptions, but this is basically the only one. Okay? This is giving Congress the power that the Articles didn't. That is, it's taking powers the states had and delegating it to the central government. So let's go through these. To lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Now they can actually tax. They get some money in. They can pay the debts and provide for the common defense. They can borrow money. This is what Alexander Hamilton was very good at. He actually balanced the U.S. budget, got our debt down to zero. Remarkable. This is a provision we'll probably spend a month on. Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. Questions to think about. What is commerce? What does regulate mean? What does among the several states mean? Can Congress regulate economic activity in a single state? We'll spend about a month on that single provision. To establish a uniform rule of naturalization, that is immigration law. A uniform rule of bankruptcy, right? The framers didn't trust states to handle bankruptcy. Why? Whenever there was a lot of people going to debt, the states would just say, okay, we forgive all the debt. You know, everyone gets out of debtor prison. So bankruptcy was a federal matter. Okay? Again, power to coin money, regulate the weight. This was right from the Articles. Punish counterfeiting of money, right? You don't have counterfeit bills. Again, establish post office and post roads. One thing to keep in mind, Congress has the power to establish post roads and post offices. There's the power to hire letter carriers and buy horses and buy wagons. Come back to that in a minute. The power to promote the progress of science and useful arts. This is what we call a patent, the protection of intellectual property. This is a biggie. Constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. We'll get to Article 3 in a minute. In 10 minutes. But Congress has the power to create the lower federal courts, right? This is something that could not be done in the Articles. We now have the power to create a unified system of federal courts. Again, our favorite pirates, right? Congress can punish piracies. Congress can declare war. Lost your moment. What does it mean to declare war? Does the president need a declaration of war to engage in hostilities? Lots of presidents have taken military action without having war declarations. Congress can grant letters of marque and reprisal. Again, I have a fake one hanging on my wall. It's very cool, but this doesn't happen very often. Congress can raise and support armies, but critically, it only lasts for 2 years. Right? They did not want a permanent standing army. Alas, we have one of those today. Also, what does it mean appropriation of money? It's up to Congress to take money out of the Treasury, right, to allocate to be spent. The president can't spend money by himself. Congress has to appropriate that funds. Congress can provide and maintain the Navy. Congress can call forth the militia to suppress insurrections. Congress can have jurisdiction over the Federal District of Columbia, which didn't quite exist yet. Now we come to this last one, which we'll probably spend 2 weeks on. This is called the Necessary and Proper Clause, often called the Elastic Clause. And it says, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Okay? Let's go back to the post office example before. Right? Congress has the power to create post office and post roads. The power to buy horses and buy wagons and hire letter carriers. Well, that's not listed in the Constitution. But I think everyone would agree that in order to have a post office, it's absolutely necessary to have someone carrying the mail. Right? You need horses. You need wagons. So even though there's no specific enumerated power, it's necessary to have horses. This gives Congress additional authority to go after the problem, right? If they have a post office, they need horses, they need the letter carriers. Okay? So is it necessary to have horses to have a post system? Yeah, you betcha. Now, what does necessary mean? Does it mean absolutely necessary? You can't do without it? Does it mean is it convenient? One of the first big cases, does Congress need a federal bank, the Bank of the United States, in order to regulate commerce? Chief Justice Marshall, in the case of McCulloch v. Maryland, says yes. We'll get there later. But this is a very important provision which we'll talk about at some length. Okay? All right, so now we move on to Article 1, Section 9, okay? All right, this is talking about the slave trade. The migration and importation of such persons. Again, they don't use the word slaves. They use these euphemisms. Other persons, such persons. There was a legitimate guilt. They actually were very guilty about what they were doing. They knew it was not going to be looked upon favorably. So they use these other sorts of words, like other persons, such persons. The slave trade could not be prohibited until 1808. In other words, we're going to leave this, the triangle trade, right, from the Caribbean to the Europe back to Africa, right? They were going to leave this slave trade in place for at least 20 years. Why? If they had tried to eradicate slavery at the outset, we've had no ratification, no constitution. This was a temporary compromise. And indeed, in 1808, the slave trade was prohibited. Okay. The privilege of habeas corpus, what's this? Habeas corpus means show me the body, right? Remember Corpus Christi, right? The body of Christ. Show me the body. In the American legal tradition, if you are held in captivity, you can ask a judge, saying, hey judge, why am I being detained? And the government must bring the body forward, produce the body. Okay? A bill of attainder, well, I won't mention this much. What's a bill of attainder? It's a law passed by Congress to punish one person. Congress can't do that. The way to punish a single person is through a judicial proceeding, not by an act of Congress. What's an ex post facto law? It criminalizes something done in the past, right? So let's say today I drive 65 miles an hour. Okay, speed limit 65, I'm good. Tomorrow the legislature says, aha, we're going to make this speed limit 60 miles per hour effective yesterday, right? When I did it, it was perfectly fine. But they made what it was lawful, unlawful. And that was not permitted. All right, what else? Again, this is a biggie. Only Congress can appropriate withdrawing money from the Treasury. All right? This one. This is irrelevant, which we might talk about this semester. No title of nobility should be granted by the United States. We don't have royalty. We'll never be royals. And no person holding any office of profit or trust under the United States shall, without the consent of the Congress, except of any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. This is the issue that's being actively litigated. I'm involved in litigation, but as a general matter, it prevents certain federal officials from receiving an emolument, which is an odd word, but generally means something of value, debating exactly what that means. To prevent these people from accepting foreign items of value. I'll leave it for there. If you want to talk about it later, we can. Section 10. States can't enter into treaties, alliances. Okay. Notice what's going on here, though. The first 9 sections of Article 1 concern the federal government, right? What can the federal government do? What can it not do? Here, what's going on? The states. It's putting limits on the states. This is actually a remarkable provision, right? The central government is telling the states what they can or can't do. The states are voluntarily putting themselves under this regime. They're surrendering their own authority. So what can states not do? They can't enter into treaties. They can't pass these bills of attainder. They can't pass ex post facto laws. They can't impair the obligation of contracts. This goes back to the debtor prison, right? Where the states would always just wipe out debt by eliminating mortgages and various other licenses. States can't grant titles of nobility. Okay, section 10. All right. We are done with Article 1, right? That is all the powers of Congress and a few limitations on the states. We move on to Article 2. What's Article 2? Executive, thank you. The presidency, right? You only need to know this one goal. Know the breakdown. Article 2, Section 1. The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. What is the executive power? Constitution gives you some hints, but it doesn't spell it out with any detail. In fact, there's a difference, right? Article 1, Section 1 began, all legislative powers herein granted, right? Only the powers granted in this Article 1 are given to Congress. In contrast, here the President has the executive power, not the executive powers, like you can count them, right? It's this body of authority called the executive power. Was that the authority the king had? Talk about it. But whatever that executive power is, was given, vested, right? It's called the vesting clause, was vested in a president. Not two presidents, not three presidents. A single, one president. Right? At the time, many states had governors with three people, triumvirates. Our system considered that, rejected it. It was a single president. The president shall hold his office in 4 years. There were many proposals. For example, Hamilton wanted a lifetime monarch, right? Once elected, he would hold office forever. Hamilton was a bit of a monarchist. Put that part into the musical, right? So the president, together with the vice president, should be elected as follows. I'm not going to go too much into this because it will ultimately change, but our system of electing presidents is based on the electoral college, right? We don't vote directly for the president. Every state votes for electors. How many electors does each state have? Easy. You count the number of representatives plus the number of senators. So pick on poor Rhode Island, right? Rhode Island has 1 representative and 2 senators. Therefore, a state has at least 3 electoral votes. California has I lost count, 50-something representatives plus 2 senators. They have almost 57 electoral votes. So the bigger states have a bigger share in the electoral college. This is exactly why the southern states wanted to have a bigger population. More population, more representatives. More representatives, more electoral votes, and a bigger share in the presidential process. That was not an accident. Okay? And the person having the greatest votes becomes the president. Qualifications: the president must be a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. This issue comes up far too often. In the event of the removal of the president, the duty devolves on the vice president. So this is one of the other bucket of spit responsibilities, not very much. Okay? This is an important point. The president's salary is set by Congress, but it can't be either increased or decreased during his term in office. Why? Imagine if the president's doing stuff and Congress doesn't like him. And Congress says, okay, we're going to reduce your salary to 0. That would frustrate the separation of powers. Or imagine a different situation. Congress says, hey, Mr. President, we'd like you to pass this bill. How would you like $1 million raise? Right? So there are limitations on Congress's ability, as well as the ability of the states, to increase the emolument, that is the salary of the president. Okay? This is important, the oath of office. I'm sure a lot of you watched the inauguration, happened about a year ago to this date. And the Chief Justice presides, and the President-elect is there, and he says, I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States, and will to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. This oath has been cited by Lincoln and many others as giving the President extraordinary powers, right? Now, the power to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, Lincoln said, gave him the power to prosecute a war against the South, to keep the Union whole. One other note, every president since Washington has added to the end of this, so help me God. It's not in the Constitution, but every president said it. Okay? Article 1, Section 2. The President shall be the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. So here, you get some idea of what the executive power is. It makes the President the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. The President can also pardon offenses. We saw this recently with Sheriff Joe Arpaio, right? They can only pardon the federal offenses, not state offenses. Next paragraph. The President, by the way, there's a note of this in your book somewhere, but the pronoun he wasn't understood to be masculine only. It was a general placeholder. One of the arguments often raised against the Constitution is, oh, it means the President can't be a woman because he uses the pronoun he. That's grammatically wrong. It's wrong. The president shall have the power bind with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties. Okay? So here's how it works. The president negotiates the treaty and then submits it to the Senate for their vote. 2/3 must agree. What else does the president do? He nominates ambassadors, judges, and other officers of the United States. But he can't do so unilaterally. The Senate must agree. Here we're seeing the idea of a check and balance. The president has a lot of power to negotiate treaties and pick officers, but he must have the consent of the other branch to go forward with it. There's very little the president can do by himself. The pardon power is one of them. But virtually everything the president does can be checked by the Congress. We'll do this one also. When the Senate's in recess, the president can fill nominees. What does it mean to mean the recess of the Senate? Does that mean a 5-minute break? Does that mean a weekend break? Does that mean Christmas break? We'll do a case called Noel Canning that investigates it. Notice I'm not mentioning many cases. What I love at the first day of class, I don't have to talk about the Supreme Court. They are irrelevant. This is about the Constitution, not what the judges say. That's one of my favorite reasons why I do this class. If you notice, at the beginning of the book, Randy and I have an introduction says, for those who believe that the Constitution is more than what judges say it is, I mean that sincerely. So this class is a tribute to that message. Article 2, Section 3, the president has to give a State of the Union, right? It doesn't have to be spoken. Thomas Jefferson thought it was a waste of time. He sent a letter, but now it's usually on TV. Oh, it's going to be lit this year. Yeah, maybe we'll call it class watching. The president, this is a big one. The president has a duty to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. What does that mean? It was a serious concern that the president would not enforce the laws. This is what King George did, right? He suspended the laws. So the president has an obligation to execute the laws in good faith. The same way you have a contract, right? You have duties on both parties. You have to faithfully execute a contract. I view the Constitution in a similar fashion. Okay? Article 2, Section 4. The president, vice president, and civil officers, which I think excludes the senators and representatives, can be removed from office and impeachment. On what grounds? Treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. We'll do a class on bribery, on impeachment. What exactly is a high crime misdemeanor? A very, very timely question. Okay? That's it for Article 2. Notice how much shorter it is, right? Article 1 was really long. Article 2 was only a couple paragraphs. The powers of Congress are defined with precision, or relative precision. The powers of the executive are, right, open-ended, right? Now, if you think the powers of the executive are open-ended, wait till we get to the courts, right? Right? Article 3, Section 1. This is about the judiciary. The Constitution creates one court, and only one court, the Supreme Court. Right? Congress could not eradicate the Supreme Court if they tried. They'd have to pass an amendment to the Constitution, right? They will be there forever. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, only one. So ask yourself, what is the judicial power? Not the judicial powers, plural, like you can count them. The judicial power. This is similar to the executive power. It's a huge body of whatever authority that Congress is placing inside this Supreme Court. Is the power to review cases? We'll get there. And they can also establish inferior courts. Now, inferior doesn't mean that they're stupid, right? That they're dumb. It just means below the Supreme Court. So in our system, we have a Supreme Court. Below that, we have what are called circuit courts of appeals, and then we have what are called district courts. Right? We have 3 layers in our federal system. So Congress can create circuit courts and district courts. They can also destroy them, right? They can. Maybe we should. But they can separate them, tear them apart. They can't get rid of the judges, but they can get rid of their courts, perhaps. Why? Because judges hold their office during good behavior. This is not like the King of England who could fire judges who he didn't like. Judges hold basically life tenure. Not exactly, but so long as they don't screw up and get impeached, they can collect their salary for life. And the salary cannot be diminished. Judges keep salary for life. Now, they're not required to get raises either. And judges often complain that they don't get enough raises. This actually is litigation over this. Okay? Now, Article 3, Section 2 doesn't define what the judicial power is, but it says where it extends to. I'll give you one easy example. Now, you all remember from CivPro diversity jurisdiction, right? 1333? You all remember that, right? You ever wonder where it came from? The judicial power shall extend to all cases and controversies between citizens of different states. Aha! Right? You learned why we have diversity, so everyone gets a fair shake. You're in a federal court, you're not subject to the local judge who doesn't like you. But how come Congress can enact Section 1333, which gives courts diversity jurisdiction? That, right? Every act of Congress you study came from the Constitution. You never thought of that, but that's where it came from, right? And I'll tell you, one of the most important cases we'll do this semester, Dred Scott v. Sanford, you've all heard of it, was about diversity jurisdiction. Was Dred Scott a slave who was a citizen? If he was a citizen, he could bring a diversity suit. If he was not a citizen, he could not bring a diversity suit. The entire case is about diversity jurisdiction. You didn't know that, but now you do. We'll study this case later. Okay. Other cases involving ambassadors, etc., are under the judicial power. Okay. The next paragraph is relevant for a case we'll study on Tuesday, which is the famous one, Marbury v. Madison. The Constitution says, in all cases affecting ... ambassadors, public ministers, and those which a state shall be a party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. What does that mean, original jurisdiction? It means you can file a case right in the Supreme Court at the outset. You don't have to start in the lower court. In all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, right? The Supreme Court reviews lower court judgments. In the first case you'll read for class next week, Marbury v. Madison, poor William Marbury sued against James Madison where? Not in the lower court, but in the U.S. Supreme Court. Congress told him, you can sue in the Supreme Court. Go right there. Did Congress have the power to expand the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court? Or did the Constitution fix it, set it in place, that only these 3 or 4 heads of jurisdiction, right? Ambassadors, ministers, states. Can Congress expand the court's original jurisdiction? I'll tell you now, Marshall is probably wrong about it, but we'll read that in class next week. But don't be afraid to say a judge is wrong. They often are. And often their decisions are not the best reading of the law. Okay? Now, the next provision. The trial of all crimes, except in cases of impeachment, shall be by jury. That's a big deal, but only for criminal cases. Okay. Section 3 we'll skip. Aha, okay, now into Article 4. After we get to Article 3, it gets a little hodgepodge, right? It's somewhat jumbled, there's a logic, but not as clear. We have a full faith and credit clause, right? Remember we had one of those in our original Constitution. Full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every state. Okay? The citizens of each state shall be entitled to privileges and immunities. Again, only applies to citizens. If you're a slave or you're a citizen, debated, right? Because if you were a citizen, you got these rights, you got these privileges and immunities. If you weren't, again, even though Dred Scott was about diversity jurisdiction, it implicated this clause. Because if you're a citizen for diversity jurisdiction, you're also a citizen for the Constitution. You never thought diversity was so important, did you? It's a very, very big deal. Okay. Again, you have this business about fleeing from justice. This is about runaway slaves. It says, no person held to service or labor. Again, they don't use the slavery word. They just can't bring themselves to use it. They call them persons held to service or labor. If they run away, they'll be delivered back to the southern state. Article 4, Section 3, we're right on time, by the way. Article 4, Section 3 provided the new admission of states, right? At the time, 13-something states, West expansion. And they recognized that new states would have to be added to this regime. Okay? Now, next. The United States shall guarantee to every state Republican form of government. Now, this doesn't mean a Republican like Ronald Reagan. It means representative, right? If a state became some sort of tyranny or like, monarchy without representation, Congress could intervene. It doesn't come up much. You'll probably never see this clause ever again, but it's there. Aha. Is the Constitution fixed? Can the Constitution be changed? The answer is, of course it can be. Ain't easy though. It is not easy. Article 5 provides the blueprint by which the Constitution can be amended. It's a very difficult process, deliberately so. It was not meant to be easy to amend the Constitution. Now, you recall, under the Articles of Confederation, how many states had to agree to amend it? All of them. Here, it's a little bit different to amend. Step 1, okay? The amendment has to be proposed. How do you propose an amendment? Either 2/3 of both houses of Congress or 2/3 of the states, right? Either or. We've never had the latter option with the Convention of the States. Hasn't happened yet. Might happen one day. I don't know. But the traditional method is 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate propose an amendment. That's step 1. Step 2, 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. And they have to ratify it, okay, by their legislatures. Okay? It's very tough to amend the Constitution. We've only had 27 amendments in 200 odd years. To get 75% of the states to agree on anything is really tough. The last amendment ratified was in 1991 or 1990, give or take. I used to say, I often say, most people never have lived through a constitutional amendment. If you're born after 91, you probably won't. So if you were born before 91, welcome to the club. But increasingly, year after year, fewer as it contracts. There was only one limitation that put on the amendment process: the slave trade. The slave trade, which was going to be in existence at least 1808, could not be limited beforehand. So there's actually a limit put on the slave trade. Also, Senate. No amendment can be ratified that would deprive a state of 2 senators. All right. Article 6. We're almost done with the Constitution, almost on to the amendments. All debts contracted by the Articles of Government beforehand are now binding on the government. This was a big deal. The federal government assumed all the debts that were in effect. This helped bring the states into the fold. The next provision is quite possibly the most important provision in the entire Constitution. I don't say that lightly. It reads, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States which will be made in pursuance thereof, and all the treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land." Let me say that again. Shall be the supreme law of the land. One of the biggest defects of the Article of Government is that people ignore Congress. Congress passes laws and no one listens to them. Different ballgame here. The laws of Congress, the Constitution itself, and the treaties ratified by Congress are the supreme law. Judges in the states are bound by that law. And more importantly, anything in a state constitution or state law to the contrary is null and void. A state law that conflicts with the U.S. Constitution or a federal statute or treaty has no legal effect, and both federal judges and state judges will see to it that it has no effect. This is the concept Hamilton wrote about in Federalist 78 of the judicial duty. We often speak of judicial review, right, that a court strikes down a law. It's not that simple. Judges have the obligation to apply the higher law. If you have a constitution and a state statute, judges have a duty to apply the Constitution as a higher law. So it's not that judges are striking down laws, they're applying the higher law according to their judicial duty. John Marshall did in-depth judicial review. He gets way too much credit. The most overrated justice of all time, John Marshall is, after Oliver Wendell Holmes. You'll learn why later. Very overrated. But this is the fulcrum that holds the entire Constitution together. Without this, it falls apart. Without the supremacy clause, it doesn't work. If states can just ignore federal law, we have a league of friendship again. We're back to the Articles. Okay. Article 7. Aha, we get to the end of the Constitution, right? That's the amendments. We're not done yet, don't worry. The ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution. What did the Articles say? Perpetual union, unanimous consent. When is this document ratified? 9 out of 13. That's not 100%. That's 9 out of 13. So the very act of amending and ratifying the Constitution was not in accordance with the Articles. Some may say the Constitution is unconstitutional. I encourage you to make that argument. Okay. But I want you to understand this. The framers of the Constitution were not just, political theorists, right? They were practical statesmen. They were trying to establish a new government that may work, may not work. And they took some shortcuts. Shortcut here. Indeed, they were not able to get unanimous consent to ratify the Constitution. It didn't work. Everyone understand? Right? So the Constitution was indeed submitted to the states in 1787, and it took nearly 2 years for it to be ratified. The last 2 states, was it Rhode Island and North Carolina, they never ratified it. Eventually they came around. But this new government went into effect with only 11 out of 13 states on board. It's a remarkable proposition. Remarkable proposition. During the state ratification conventions, one of the biggest hang-ups is we want a Bill of Rights. We want something to secure our liberties against violation by the federal government. And the framers of the Constitution promised, look, ratify this now, and the first order of business will be a Bill of Rights. And indeed, that's more or less what happened. James Madison, who was a member of Congress from Virginia, was intimately involved in drafting the Bill of Rights. And the very first Congress in 1789 submitted 12 amendments to the states. They only ratified 10 of them, right? So here's another fun trivia fact for you, right? What we call the first 10 amendments, right, were actually 12 proposed amendments. What we call the First Amendment involving free speech, that was the Third Amendment. Right? The first 2 were not ratified right away. What we call the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, was actually the Fourth Amendment. So, fun fact, you'll win a bar bet one night. But the first 2 amendments concern how to allocate representatives in Congress, and the second proposed amendment concerned pay of Congress. Now, as I think I mentioned to you, the most recently enacted amendment, I'll scroll down all the way, is the 27th Amendment. This was originally proposed in 1791 and wasn't ratified until I think it was 1990 or 1991, fairly recently. And this basically says Congress can't give itself a pay raise. Any changes in salary take place after the next election. Query for a minute. How can an amendment proposed in 1791 be ratified 200 years later? All these states didn't even exist yet, right? Fairly big legal issue. The other first proposed amendment didn't go anywhere either. Okay. So I'm going to start here, though, with the Bill of Rights, which were ratified in 1791. They were proposed in 1789. The first 10 amendments were ratified in 1791. Now I'll go through these in the remaining half hour. Plenty of time. The First Amendment, which is unfortunately something we don't have much time to spend on, we'll cover it the last day of class, is something you should focus on. In fact, there's a special class in the First Amendment. If I inspire you, you should take it later on in law school. Take the classes you love. The First Amendment provides, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, 1, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, 2, or abridging the freedom of speech, 3, or of the press, 4, or of the right of the people peacefully to assemble, 5, and to petition the government for redress of grievances, 6. There are 6 distinct guarantees in the First Amendment. I want to go through them one at a time. First off, Congress. Congress shall make no law. Can the states censor the press? Can the states establish a religion? I think I said no. Can the states violate rights of free exercise? As originally drafted in 1791, the Constitution did not put this constraint on the states. The first 8 amendments of the Constitution only controlled the federal government. You'll read this in a case called Barron versus City of Baltimore. It's most obvious in the First Amendment. This was only a limitation on Congress. At the time of the founding, believe it or not, I think almost half the states had established churches. It's true. States routinely limited free press. It was Congress that couldn't. Now pause for a minute, right? Constitution ratified 1789. Bill of Rights ratified 1791. During that 2-year window, could Congress have passed a law censoring the press? Could Congress have censored the press between 1789 and 1791? Well, there's no Bill of Rights, right? But what power would give Congress the ability to censor the press? Remember Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers? Was there any power? Congress had the power to regulate newspapers, right? Even without this protection of rights, Congress had the power to enact the law in the first place. The second thing I want to point out here, does the Constitution say you have the right of free speech, and you have the right of free exercise, and you have the right of petitioning the government? No. The Constitution is framed as a negative. Congress, you can't do this. Congress, you can't do that. You can't quarter troops. You can't restrict the right to bear arms, right? That's significant. We don't have a Constitution that gives us rights. This is perhaps the biggest misconception why I hate the phrase Bill of Rights. We don't get rights from government. The right of free speech doesn't come from the Constitution. Indeed, if you read the Declaration, which I encourage you to do, the right of free speech predates our government. Where it comes from, we can argue. The common law, God, natural rights, call it whatever you want. But the Constitution doesn't give out rights, doesn't hand them out. This right of religion, exercise, speech, it exists before the Constitution. And what this document says is, Congress, you can't violate this pre-existing right. That's an important provision people don't understand. We don't have a Constitution that hands out rights. It's not like Oprah, you get a car and you get a car, right? No. These rights predate, it's not in mine, right? These rights predate the Constitution. So what does it mean to make the law respecting the establishment of religion, right? Well, as I mentioned, a lot of states had established churches. This is my reading, I think it's the best reading, you're not bound by, is that this meant Congress couldn't interfere with state churches, right? That if Maryland wanted to be Calvinist and Connecticut wanted to be Catholic, and whatever it happened to be, making this up, Congress couldn't come and say, no, we want a single Unitarian church or a single Methodist church, right? The states had autonomy to make their own churches. What does it mean to respect the free exercise? Well, exercise generally meant conscience, right? A free conscience, that Congress couldn't intrude upon that. What is a freedom of speech? Does it include things today like video games and pornography and who knows what? Does the press have any special privileges? Who is the press? Is a blogger or a tweeter the press? What does it mean to assemble? Does that mean the right of people to associate with each other, to have private membership lists? Can the government require the NAACP hand over their membership roster? What does it mean to petition the government for redress of grievances? Right? Can you tweet at the president if he blocks you back, right? These are questions on our horizon. The Second Amendment, regrettably, I don't have time to cover this semester. Too many other things are added. So I'll do it briefly here. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. What is the connection between the first clause, the militia clause, and the second clause, the rights clause? Does one control the other? Is this a collective right? That is a right for the militia, or is this an individual right? And what does it mean, shall not be infringed, or any regulation permissible on gun laws? I'll try to cut this, but a lot of stuff we can't cover this semester. I wish we had 6 hours of property. We'd have so much more fun, but unfortunately we have only 4. You're stuck with me for these 2 hours. Okay. The Third Amendment. No soldier shall, in times of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. This was one of the direct grievances in the Bill of Rights. Recall, the redcoats, the British soldiers, were quartered, were housed in American homes. So, unless the owner consents, they can't be housed. But in times of war, they can be by law, by statute. This amendment is almost never litigated. It did come up recently, though, a fun case where the police wanted to enter someone's home to scope out, to watch some crime scene across the street. And the homeowner said no. And the actual lawsuit saying, aha, the police are violating my Third Amendment rights, trying to enter my house to live there. And the court held that the police were not soldiers. There's another case a couple of years ago where there's some sort of natural disaster, and a park ranger basically broke into a guy's house, right? The safe harbor doctrine from torts, you might recall. And the question was this a Third Amendment violation? And the court said no. Park ranger's not a soldier, so Yogi Bear is okay. Okay. The Fourth Amendment, which we won't mention at all this semester, but you will take Crim Pro, right? By the way, students always say, Josh, I want to do constitutional law. I'll be a constitutional lawyer. Like, good, go do criminal law, right? The Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments are constitutional law. It's not sexy like free speech, but it's Constitution. It's in there, right? It's Josh, you'll do ConLaw. Go become a criminal defense lawyer. Go become a prosecutor, right? You'll do lots of ConLaw. The Fourth Amendment says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, describing with particularity the place to be searched. This was a direct response to what were called general warrants. General warrants, where the king would say, I authorize Inspector Javert to search all the homes in Boston for property tax violations, right? It wasn't specific. It was a John's house or Sally's house. It wasn't, I think there's crime going on in Bill's house. It was, the general can search everything. We don't have that. To do a search, it must be reasonable. It must be reasonable. Now, if you read this carefully, you don't need to have a warrant for it to be a reasonable search, right? One's not connected to the other, but under current case law, a search without a warrant is presumptively unreasonable. And how do you get a warrant? You show probable cause, that there's likely a crime being committed, to an independent judge, and to describe with particularity what you want to search. In other words, you can't tell a judge, hey, I want to search 80 people's houses, I think they might be doing something stupid, right? You have to give a specific crime they're committing and evidence. Now, it's not actually very hard to get a warrant. Most judges rubber stamp them. But there is a restriction that did not exist before. The Fifth Amendment is very important, and there are lots of provisions which are more or less hodgepodge together. You all know, oh, I plead the Fifth, right? I plead the Fifth. There's a lot more in the Fifth Amendment than just that. So, in order to prosecute someone in the federal system, you need to have a grand jury indictment. What does that mean? A group of people convene in secrecy who tell a prosecutor, yes, go forward with this prosecution, or no, there's not enough evidence. Now, it's very easy to indict someone. You can indict a ham sandwich, as the expression goes. But it is a check on federal prosecution power. Now, double jeopardy, which you may have heard of, you can't be tried twice for the same offense by the federal government. However, you can be tried twice by a state government. So if you get prosecuted once by the feds and again by the states for the same offense, that is kosher. You can do that. Okay? Now, next. No one should be compelled to be a witness against himself. This is, I plead the Fifth, right? You can't be compelled to testify against yourself. Okay? The next part. Nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This is probably the most important sentence in the Bill of Rights. Probably the most important. I think the free speech is overrated, right? Let me tell you something. The structural provisions on government are more important than rights. You want to see a beautiful constitution? Go read the Soviet Union Constitution. It protects every manner of rights, speech and religion. It wasn't worth the paper it was written on. It's the structure that holds a republic together. And this one's really important. Really, really important. Right? If the government wants to deprive you of your life, your liberty, your freedoms, or your property, they must do so with the due process of law. What is this phrase, due process of law? We'll spend probably half the semester on it. This is a phrase that stretches all the way back to Magna Carta, this great document drafted in 1215 by the British government, by the British people. The due process of law requires the government to comply with certain processes, that is, what processes due to you. But it also imparts some sort of fairness, right? The government can't act arbitrarily. They can't act randomly. They can't act capriciously with their actions. They must accord people the due process of law. This is a very big deal. The last provision we won't talk about in this class, but we'll cover in Property 2 next semester. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. If the government wants to build a bridge or a highway or a hospital on your home, they gotta pay you for it. And they gotta persuade a judge first. So they can't arbitrarily take away your property. Now, the government wants to take your home to build a hotel or a hospital, or a shopping mall. Under recent case law, they can do that as well. That's more of a public purpose, though, than public use. Moving on, Amendment 6. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state where the crime was committed. This is not like in England where people were tried overseas for those offenses, right, by British juries. If you want to be convicted of a crime, you have to have an American jury for the place where you committed the offense. Local people who know you and can give you a fair shake. The framers, for their warts and all, they were very concerned about oppressive criminal proceedings. They were very much concerned about that. You also have the right to confront witnesses, right? So if someone accuses you of a crime, you have the right to cross-examine them, right? That's actually in the Constitution, to cross-examine your accuser. That's a big deal. And also you have the right to assistance of counsel. You have a lawyer with you. It doesn't mean the government will pay for it, right? But in a case called Gideon v. Wainwright years later, the court said that the government will pay for counsel. Okay. All right, moving along. We got 15 minutes left. We're right on track, I promise. 15 minutes left. We're at 20 amendments. The Seventh Amendment doesn't come up much. It guarantees a civil jury trial for matters of more than $20. No inflation, so still $20. So that's why in the federal system you have a right to a jury trial. The Eighth Amendment we won't cover in this class, but this is prohibitions on excessive bail, fines, and cruel and unusual punishment. What makes a punishment cruel and unusual? Is that based on what was cruel in 1791, or is it an evolving standard of decency? Take another class of the Eighth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment and the 10th Amendment are very important. These are two sides of the same coin. Now, I just spent 10 minutes describing you have this right. You know, you have speech, and you have religion, and the right to bear arms, and this and that, right? Are those all the rights that people have? Or do people have other rights that are not listed? There was a fear in drafting the Bill of Rights that by listing these 8 or 9 rights, you're saying, okay, but this is it. You have no other rights that are protected. The Ninth Amendment was designed to rebut that argument. Did you learn in contracts the expressio unius canon? Remember this? Where if you have something's included, you know this? The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights, speech, religion, etc., shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. What does that mean? Just because we listed these 8 or 9 rights doesn't mean you don't have other rights. But what are those other rights? Where do they come from? Who decides what those other rights are? Congress? The courts? God? What are these rights retained by the people? We'll spend a lot of time on this question. And the 10th Amendment is the flip side. The powers not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution, nor prohibited to the states, are reserved to the states respectively. This is the notion I led off with. In 1776, in New York, the king had all the power. After independence was won, New York had that power. New York delegated that power, some of it at least, to the central government. But powers that were not delegated to the United States are retained by New York. In other words, The powers given by the states to the Constitution are belonging to the federal government, but everything that's not delegated are retained by the states. This is the recognition that states retain their police power that they received upon independence. And I note this briefly. Texas did not exist in 1776, but it's treated the same way as a state. All new states are entered on equal footing as older states. Okay. That is the Bill of Rights. We move on. The 11th Amendment. It provides the judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law and equity prosecuted against one of the U.S. citizens. What does this mean? You can't sue a foreign state, right? So you're all citizens of Texas. You can't file a lawsuit against Louisiana in federal court. You can't do it. Can you sue Texas? Well, the text of the amendment doesn't prevent you from suing Texas, but the Supreme Court has butchered this provision. And under current law, a citizen cannot sue any state, right? You can sue state officials for certain type of relief, but you can't sue Texas without their consent because of what's called sovereign immunity. We'll do this next week, I think. Amendment 12. This is a long, tedious amendment. How do we elect the president and the vice president? Under the original Constitution, there was no ticket, right? Where Obama and Biden ran together and Trump and Pence ran together. That's not how it worked. You actually ran against each other. Whoever got the most votes was president, and the second most votes was vice president, right? Imagine having a President Trump and Vice President Clinton. That would be perhaps even more entertaining than what we have now, right? That didn't work out so well. So you had President Jefferson and Vice President Burr, and they hated each other. They hated each other, right? Burr killed Hamilton while he was VP, right in office, right? So under this new one, you basically have a ticket, right? You run for vice president and president separately. I think that was an improvement. After that, there were no amendments for decades, right? The 11th and 12th Amendments were ratified in fairly short order. The next batch of amendments were not ratified until after the Civil War. These are called the Reconstruction Amendments. 13, 14, 15. Now write these down. 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment were the Reconstruction Amendments. These amendments fundamentally transformed our republic. Before the Civil War, the states were largely trusted to manage their own internal affairs. That didn't work out so well, slavery and all. After the Civil War, the Congress said, screw this. We are going to have a bigger role for the federal government to manage civil rights. And these amendments, which were ratified in a, frankly, probably not legitimate way, with a lot of the southern states in disrepair during Reconstruction, they're legitimate. But it was ratified in a very coercive fashion. These amendments change how our Constitution functions. The 13th Amendment provides neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as the punishment for a crime, shall exist within the United States. What does this mean? This is the first provision of the Constitution that operates directly on individuals. The Constitution usually talks about government. States can do this, Congress can do that, the president can do this, right? This is on private slave owners. It says slavery shall not exist, period. Period. End of sentence. Doesn't matter if it's a government slave or a private slave. It can't exist. By the way, chain gangs, right? Oh, brother, where art thou? You can have it if you're convicted. You can basically. They were worried that prisoners would bring these sorts of claims. So if you were convicted of a crime, you could be enslaved. By the way, a lot of laws were enacted where fairly minor offenses used to throw black people back in slavery, called peonage laws. It was under this section. Shall exist. Section 2. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. What does this mean? Congress got some new power. It's not just Article 1, Section 8. They also have what's called Section 2 powers here. They have the power to make sure there's no slavery, right? How do they do this? They can authorize a lawsuit, right? That if a person's held as a slave, that person can go to federal court and sue the slave owner saying, hey, you're violating the Constitution. This gives Congress the power to ensure, to eradicate slavery. We'll do cases on this later. The next one's biggie. This is basically half the semester. The 14th Amendment. This is probably the most important amendment in the entire Constitution. Lots of provisions. We'll go through them in 5 minutes. Section 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States of the state wherein they reside. This was a design to reverse Dred Scott. We keep going back to citizenship, right? If you were born in the United States, by virtue of birth, you are a citizen. And not just a citizen of the United States, but a citizen of the state. You get your diversity jurisdiction, right? You get your diversity. Now they're full citizens. And with that, they get rights. States cannot deprive these persons of their privileges or immunities, right? Saying, look, this is mostly about the freedmen, right? The freed slaves. You're now citizens, and now states cannot deprive your privileges or immunities, your rights. Again, nullifying Dred Scott. Additionally, states can no longer deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Again, the Fifth Amendment only applies to the federal government. Now the states were bound by a due process clause. This was new. We have this new provision, this last one. Nor deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. What does that mean? That everyone has to be treated equally? Or the law has to be applied equally? If the law says you have separate train cars for black and white people, and you enforce that law vigorously, is that equal protection of the laws? We'll get there. Section 2 discusses how representatives are apportioned based on the whole numbers. This nullifies 3/5 clause, right? It's saying now when we're counting population, all persons, 100% are counted. Okay. Now, the 14th Amendment didn't actually give the vote to the freedmen. That came a couple years later. But what it says is if any state deprived people on the right to vote based on their color, the state would lose representation. It's like a cudgel. Okay. I might put it later. And Section 5. Okay? Section 5. The Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. If a state is violating a person's rights, Congress can pass a law to prevent it. Congress can pass a law to prevent it. This provision, which we just call Section 5. If I ever put this in your notes, if I say Section 5, that's what I'm talking about. It's Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. It gives Congress additional powers to eradicate violations by states. If the state's violating a person's civil rights, they're acting under Section 5 power. Okay? Okay. We have 5 minutes left, we'll make it through. The 15th Amendment. The right to vote shall be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Right? This extended the right to vote to the freedmen, not the freedwomen. That would not come till later. And again, Congress has the power to enforce the provision. The 16th Amendment creates the power of income tax. Right? The power to tax. Before this, you'd only tax based on excises, like you have a tax on whiskey, for example. Now Congress can actually tax people based on how much money they earn. This was new, without concern of population. The 17th Amendment radically transformed the republic. As you recall, originally senators were appointed by the state legislatures. But now they will be elected by the people. This shifted federalism, right? The states had less of a role in picking members of Congress, zero role in fact, and now it's up to the people to select. That's the 17th Amendment. Okay? The 18th Amendment is one people in this room probably not going to like very much, but it banned the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquor, alcohol. Okay? Alcohol. Notice it didn't ban the drinking of it, or even possessing of it. It just banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation.
query, if you will, for a moment. Why do we need an amendment to ban the sale of alcohol, but not to ban the sale of narcotics and other drugs? We'll come back to this. This was ratified, and it created an era called Prohibition. Now, I'll fast forward for a minute. The 21st Amendment, which was ratified, repealed the 18th Amendment. So you can actually repeal an amendment. Prohibition was so unpopular, it was actually rescinded several years later. Although we still have dry counties. Why? Because states still are allowed to punish the sale of alcohol as they see fit. Okay? In fact, there's actually a bar in the District of Columbia called the 21st Amendment, which celebrates every year Prohibition Day, where prohibition was eradicated. Okay? 19th Amendment gave suffrage the right to vote to women, right? That the right to vote shall be denied in count of sex. This was ratified, I think, almost 50 years after the 15th Amendment gave the right to vote to, without regard to color. Okay? The 20th Amendment set the term of when the presidency begins and ends, January 20th at noon. Okay? The 21st Amendment we already did. Okay, we're on target. The 22nd Amendment. This is the Roosevelt Amendment. Starting with George Washington, there was a tradition that members of the president would serve 2 terms and then step down. First, Teddy Roosevelt tried running for a 3rd term. He didn't win. Then Franklin Roosevelt won a 3rd term. He did win. He won a 4th term also. So this says no person should be elected the president more than twice. It limits the term in office. The 23rd Amendment allows the District of Columbia to have electoral votes. That is, people in Washington, D.C. can actually vote for members of Congress. The 24th Amendment eradicates poll taxes and other devices used to suppress the right to vote. The 25th Amendment, which you probably have read about in recent weeks, provides what happens if the president dies or resigns. The VP becomes president. If the VP slot becomes vacant, the president shall nominate a vice president. Okay? Then we get to another one, Section 3. If the president tells Congress, hey, I'm going to be under anesthesia, right? I'm going to be out of office, let the vice president step in. This is the number 4. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, which is very popular now, is what happens if the vice president and the majority of Congress, majority of the cabinet, tell Congress that the president can't discharge his duties. That has the effect of removing the president from power for a short period of time, at which point the president can reassert himself, and it requires a 2/3 vote of both houses to remove the president. This is a fantasy. It will not happen. It will not happen. It will not happen. You need more votes to remove the 25th Amendment than through impeachment. Not going to happen. Okay, moving on. The 26th Amendment gives the right to vote to 18-year-olds, dropping it down from 21 or wherever it was before. And with 1 minute to spare, the 27th Amendment, which was originally proposed in 1791, means that Congress cannot give itself a pay raise. Thank you all very much. Thank you. And I'll see you all on Tuesday. Thank you so much. And if you didn't get a name card, whatever, come up and I'll help you out. Thank you.